we're kind of moving on from Hanukkah, but we're not really moving on from Hanukkah in a sense, because as my book says, accessing the hidden light of creation all year round. That's the whole point. It's, is distinction between, let's say, other holidays and Purim and Hanukkah, because Purim and Hanukkah really are just two different sides of the same coin. The other holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, they all commemorate an event that happened once in history. Now, the truth is, it is true that every time a holiday comes around, a certain portal opens up, and we're accessing a light in the here and now that was the basis of the holiday back then. And also, Hanukkah commemorates an event that also took place at some point in time. But as the Pri Tzaddik points out, that Hanukkah and Purim both represent a certain celebration of an event, because even though Hanukkah really represents or celebrates the victory of the Hashmonaim over the mighty Greek army, and of course the miracle of the oil, that those are more the benefits of what actually happened at that time. Meaning that what was really going on, the real miracle of Hanukkah, was the influx of Or HaGenuz, hidden light of creation. And that's what resulted eventually, as we spoke about, the idea of going to a higher realm and being able to access the light on a much higher, unfiltered level. And as a result of that, so then on that level, what we would call the many against the few becomes the few against many, because the Greeks have power down here. The enemies of the Jewish people have power in this world, in the physical world. When the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, they were covered by the Anei Kavod, the clouds of glory. There are 7 different clouds that encompass the Jewish people. Some of them were specifically to raise the desert, mountains, and make the path very smooth and flat, so they wouldn't have to climb up and go over and around, which is like a big plow, so to speak. And the other ones protected the Jewish people from the elements of the desert. And it says that Amalek attacked the Jewish people. So the question is, how was Amalek able to attack the Jewish people if they're protected by the Anei Kavod? And the answer is because there are some people who did not live up to the spiritual level necessary to be able to be in the clouds of glory, because it was by invitation only, meaning that you had to be ruh, you had to be fit in the same way you can only go to the base of Mikdash, the temple, if you're spiritually fitting. If you're not, you have to go to the mikveh. If a person comes in contact with the dead, they have to go to the red heifer, the paraduma, to purify them, and then they could go into the base of Mikdash. It's all, even though it all exists on the same physical plane. Now, for example, that when you drive on a road and you get to a stop sign, you have to stop. Today, there's not too many stop signs because we have traffic circles instead. But there's still some places where there are lights, right? You have the rules change. You can drive straight. You can put your foot on the pedal and use the gas and drive, on the highway even quickly. But the moment you get off the highway, you get to a traffic light or traffic sign or a stoplight, then you have to stop. It's not that the spiritual realm has changed. It's just that in the physical realm, there are certain distinctions between one area and another area for the sake of safety. In the spiritual world, it's different. The rules change because the reality has changed. And this comes into play. It's a very important part of the discussion. I'm actually working on a book right now called Even Higher, about rising to a higher level than we're living on right now, because if you go back to Talmudic times, for example, the story of in the Gemara talks about how I think it was Rabbi or Rechia, I'm not exactly sure, I don't remember exactly. I think it was Rabbi who was unwell. He became sick. Rav Yochanan, he went to visit him. And when he was visiting him, the Gemara is talking about how yisurim and difficulty and pain, and how spiritually positive it is, because it allows a person to grow and to fix up and to rectify their mistakes and to atone for their sins, etc., etc. And then the Gemara goes into some cases of people who became sick, and rather than accept their suffering and just go with it, they instead reject it because it's very debilitating. And you learn from the Gemara that while you have it, you can't get rid of it. You have to work with it and use it the most efficient spiritual way possible. But that doesn't mean you don't have to get rid of it. It doesn't mean you have to live with it. If there's a solution for it, you still have to try to get out of it and do the best you can to be healed in the situation, because let's face it, pain is debilitating and suffering interferes with our mitzvah performance. So you have these two realities depending upon the situation. So Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him, do the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick, and he says to him, he says, do you accept your suffering? And he says, I don't accept my suffering, and I don't even want the reward for it. I want to get back to work. I want to go back to doing what I do best, what I love doing the most. So he says, give me your hand. He gives him his hand, and it says, Yehiv la yadei, and he gave him his hand, and then he got up. And he was able to get, he was cured just like that. Today they would call that faith healing, right? He was healed just like that. So what happened? Just he helped him out of bed, and somehow he just felt better. Was he faking the entire time? So the Arizal explains, no. Yehiv le yadei is Aramaic, but the Roshi Tevis, the first letter of each of the words, is Yud, then a Lamed, and then a Yud. And the Arizal explains that one of the names of God, it's a very difficult name, but it's kind of hard to say it, to use it, and certainly we're not on the level of holiness to use it, but it's actually, most names are just a sequence of letters. So in this case, it's a sequence of names. Each name is 3 letters long, and there are 72 sets of these 3-letter names, and they make up what's called the 72, well, actually it's often called the 72-letter name, but it's not. It's 3 times 72 letters altogether, but it's called the Shem Av, Ayin base, 72. And the second name, because the more they are towards the front, the more powerful they are, the second name is spelled Yud Lamed Yud. It's only 3 letters, but it's the name of Hashem. Very powerful name with the proper kavanah, proper intention. So this name was the name that Moshe Rabbeinu inscribed, or at least he used, when he had to go fetch the coffin of Yosef out of the Nile River, because the Egyptians put him in a metal coffin and sunk it for 2 reasons, the Medrash says. One, because he was a symbol of fertility, and the Nile River was their symbol of fertility, so they were doubling up on the fertility so that they'd be able to have, bumper crops in Egypt. And the second reason was because they heard that the Jewish people would not leave Egypt without the bones of Yosef, because he made them promise to take him up when they finally left Mitzrayim. So they wanted to hide the coffin. So fortunately, Sarah but Asher, she knew exactly where it was, and she told Moshe Rabbeinu, but it was at the bottom. In those days, they didn't have deep sea fishing tanks and things like that, and those underwater explorers to go looking for it. So instead, he did something that was even more practical. He wrote on a plate, Alei Shor. Yosef is called the shore in this week's Parsha, part of his blessing, because the shore is also the symbol of fertility and strength, so like arise shore, arise ox, referring to Yosef. And Moshe used the name Yud Lamed Yud, which is a name specifically for raising things up. So he pronounced the name, and by pronouncing the name, Kabbalistically, the coffin floated to the surface, even though it was metal and sunken inside. And this is the same name that Rav Yochanan used to raise up Rabbi Avahu, again, I think that's the name, from his illness. It gave him the koyach and healed him in the end. So even in the Talmudic period of time, we see that people were using mystical, Kabbalistic levels of medicinal practices, we'll call it, lack of better terms. And this is the ongoing, struggle in the Jewish people, because we saw that we are the twin of Esav, but we also get the name Yisrael. And Esav is a twin brother so Yaakov is the twin brother of Esav, holding onto his heel. And if we're not leading, then we're following. And if we're following, then we're subject to the hashgacha pratis of Esav, because there are 2 levels, basically, of divine providence. There's hashgacha pratis, which you may have heard the term used often, right? Which means pratis is private, so it means individual providence, personal providence, and hashgacha klalis, which is not referring to one of the kupa cholim, It's referring to the general divine providence that God uses to run the world. So, for example, there are microbes growing in this world in places that people never go to. They never see it. Somehow, those microbes exist. There's nothing that's superfluous. There's nothing that is accidental. It's there because somehow it's part of the tikkun of Ma'aseh Bereshis. And we have nothing to do with it. The same way, for example, that what's going on in the States right now, or going on in Canada, or going on, in Europe, or wherever outside of the land of Israel, it's all God. God's doing all of it. The difference is, though, is that when he functions and he runs the world inside of Israel, he uses what's called hashgacha pratis, individual providence, which is why, for example, there's so many stories of miracles coming out of the land of Israel. Someone wrote a book about divine providence stories, about miracles that have happened for Jews. And he said, you'll notice that most of the stories, and he lives in the diaspora. I don't think he lives in Eretz Israel. He certainly did at the time of the book was being written. And he said that you'll notice that most of the stories I'm telling you are about people living in the land of Israel. And the reason is because that's where most of these stories take place, inside of Eretz Israel. Outside of Eretz Israel, there's also miracles. All kinds of miracles happen for people in the diaspora, but they're more hidden. This is why King David, when he was forced to leave the land of Eretz Israel, his son forced him out. He overthrew him and he took the throne temporarily until David came back. And when he was forced to go into the land of the Pelishtim, right, the Philistines at that time, which is now Gaza Strip, right? He was there, and he said, "They have forced me out, telling me to go worship idols." So the Talmud says, who told him to worship idols? No one said that. They said go, but not to go worship idols. He added that part. So the Talmud says, because anyone who lives in the land of Israel is like somebody who has a God. Anybody who lives outside the land of Israel is like someone who doesn't have a God. What's that supposed to mean? The Gemara says also, as well, that what about a righteous person? Someone who believes in God. Listen, there's lots of shuls in Chutz La'aretz. Lots of people go to shuls. There are chesed organizations. Whatever we're doing here, they're doing there. Right? So what does that mean? So Gemara says, even still, a righteous person who believes in God and is serving God, but he's living in the diaspora, is called somebody who's serving God, serving idols. It's called avodah zarah b'tahara. Serving idols, idol worship, impurity. What do you mean? How's that possible? First of all, is he really worshiping idols? And second of all, if you're worshiping idols, how can it be impurity? So the deeper answer, of course, is that he's not worshiping idols, and that's why it's called impurity. So then why is it called worshiping idols? Because when someone lives in the diaspora, they're living with a lesser level of hashgacha pratis, of divine providence, the hashgacha klalis, the hashgacha of the nations of the world, the Gentile populations, where God hides himself more. He makes himself less visible. So it's much easier for people to be mistaken and forget about him. And even if you know intellectually, because there's two parts to the equation. There's the head part and there's the heart part. And you can have the head part anywhere in the world, but it's the heart part that makes the big difference between feeling the divine presence and not feeling. And it makes perfect sense, because if God wants the land of Israel to be a special place, it has to be a special place. Well, what makes it special? The fruit? No. Not in general. I mean, let's face it. You go to Chutz La'aretz, you see cucumbers this long, and big, and the technology and bananas without a single bruise on them, and they stay that way for days. I don't know what they're doing with them and how they make it happen. But we buy bananas in Israel. Yesterday I had a perfect banana. It was like a celebration. Literally, it was a perfect banana, because you don't get them. They usually have some marks on them. And even if they're perfect, within 2 days they turn brown. Somehow, they must inject them with something in Chutz La'aretz, but for whatever reason, what makes the fruits of Eretz Israel unique and better than all the other fruits of the world, no matter how beautiful they look, is because they're from Eretz Yisrael. And Eretz Yisrael is the land of Hashgacha Pratis, the land that Hashem says, my eye is in this land every single day, all the time. I pay attention to this land. This is I've been Mekadesh, Makdish this land. It's very, very holy, very special. And how does he do it? What is a big difference? Again, the Gemara says that there's no Torah learning like the learning of Torah in Eretz Yisrael. And even the air is machkim a person, the Gemara says. Just breathing the air. I just got wiser. Just got wiser again. Because I'm breathing the air of Eretz Yisrael. Well, how does that work? Well, these are all, expressions and metaphors, but the real underlying reason is because of the fact that God makes his presence more palpable in the land of Israel. And that has a tremendous impact. Amalek comes and attacks the Jewish people, but not the ones inside the clouds, but the stragglers, the ones who are not keeping pace with the Jewish people, who don't want to make those real hard changes to live on a higher spiritual plane. So they're outside the cloud. That's who Amalek attacks. Everybody else is safe inside the tent, inside the clouds, because they have that hashgacha pratis. So in a sense, inside the cloud was the hashgacha of Eretz Yisrael. At Mount Sinai, when God came over the mountain and spoke to the Jewish people, it says the mountain bloomed, right? The whole place, the desert turned to green. That's why in Shavuos, many people decorate the base medrash and their houses with flowers and grass and all kinds of things. And people will do it very elaborately to remind us what happened at Mount Sinai. Why was that necessary? Well, on one hand, everywhere God goes, it's like, that's life. Attempt to make him hayom, right? To Hashem, you stick to Hashem and you live. You're alive today. You're all alive today because you're sticking to the source of life. And not only that, but for the duration of time that God was over the mountain had the halachic and philosophical status of being Harabayas, Hara Moriah, the place of the Beis Hamikdash. That's one of the reasons why Aaron Cohen, he got involved with the golden calf, because he knew that if he didn't kind of like get involved, install them, and do all the things he did, even though he's held responsible anyhow for it, because he was supposed to die instead apparently, but he didn't want them to kill him, but not because he wanted to live. Obviously, he wanted to live, there's no question, but he would have died al Kaddish Hashem like his nephew, Chur, did, if necessary. But he knew that Mount Sinai at that time had the status of being the holy mount of the temple in Eretz Yisrael, even though it's still in the desert in Sinai, right? And if the halacha is that if you kill, I have to take a drink and my mother will kill me. The halacha is that if you kill the Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash, there's no atonement for the entire generation. And Aaron didn't want that to happen. So therefore, he made it that they did not kill him, knowing that Moshe is going to come back and turn the whole thing around in the end. That's because the mountain had the status of Eretz Yisrael, of Har Moriah, the Beis Hamikdash. If it wasn't for that, then they could kill him and be no problem. The other problems to atone for, but not for the whole generation, not forever like that. So you've got this overlapping reality where, on one hand, you've got the physical plane. The physical world is very physical, meaning that, things take up space. If two cars try to occupy the same space in the highway, that's called a crash. That's called a collision. It can't happen. Not safely. That's for sure. You want the second floor to be in the first floor? Well, say goodbye to the first floor, because they cannot coexist. The physical world takes up space and has rules. So if you're going to come out of the cloud and leave behind, even though it's in the same physical plane, it wasn't like this, up and down. No, it's the same. They were like little in the same, latitude, or what do you call it? The altitude. The same altitude at that time. But inside the cloud, it's as if they were literally miles above the face of the earth. So Amalek couldn't touch them, couldn't get to them. But the stragglers outside, the ones who are behind, who are literally out in the open, they're in the world of Amalek. That's the world of Amalek has power. So the entire time the Jewish people were real with the Greeks, meaning that they were in the realm that the Greeks occupied, they were subject to the rules of that realm. So the Greeks could hurt them. The Greeks could harm them. The Greeks could to force them to do things against their will and make them break Torah. What Hanukkah did was show the Jewish people that if you rise, if you elevate yourself, you get to a higher level of reality, and you go above the Greeks, then they become the minority now. Yeah, physically they have more numbers, but what difference does it make? If one guy, even the physical world, one guy has a smart bomb, that's a smartphone. A smartphone that's a dirty bomb. That's called a dirty bomb. It's a suitcase that could be a nuclear bomb. He walks in, he blows it up. Doesn't make any difference that he's only one person versus 1 million people. The 1 million people are going to suffer the results of that bomb. We know today that a few people can physically take it, but it has to work with physical properties. In the spiritual realm, they didn't have a nuclear bomb. They only had their ratzon, their will. But because they rose to a higher level, and the Greeks came after them, so to speak, on that higher level, the Greeks entered a realm that wasn't theirs, that they have no strength in because they lacked the spiritual qualifications. So as a result of that, the Jewish people were able to overcome them and beat them back. And why is this all so important? Why is this discussion so meaningful, especially today? Because we are confronted by a very difficult situation today, and especially right now, because I don't know about all around the world, but certainly here in Israel and certainly amongst the religious Jews, we're dealing with this reality of the virus, and how it's affecting us, and also in terms of the vaccine and the potential dangers that might be involved. And if you stand back, one of the questions that comes up is, basically, how do we deal with this? Do we just go with the flow? Do we just do what everyone else is doing, what Asaph is doing? Because Asaph represents basically America and Europe and England, because those are his descendants. And he has to work through the physical world. Or can we rise above that reality? And if so, do we have to still follow the same rules? This is a question, not just for today, not just for this last year, but really for the last 1,000 years. Because as the Ramban points out in Parshas Bahar, a long time ago, doctors and science, whatever you want to call it, that wasn't their job. During the time of prophecy, which was from 2448 to 3448, 1,000 years, apparently exactly, which was I forget, 12. It was I used to know this off by heart. I think it was 1213 BCE to 1313 BCE to 313 BCE. We had prophets. And Ramban says that when someone got sick, just take a look at the Torah. A Mitzorah, right? A Mitzorah, it was someone who had tsaras. Tsaras is usually translated as leprosy, but it's not the leprosy. It looks like it and it acts like it, but it's not the leprosy that we're familiar with, the leper colonies and things like that. But it started off, for example, in a person's house, went to their clothing, and then it went, not as a disease, not as a bacteria, but as divine warning. First, it went to the house. It didn't spread anywhere. If the person did tshuva and did what they had to do, it stopped at the house. If they didn't get the message that they're speaking lashon hara or doing something wrong that results in tsaras, then it went to their clothing. God has rachmanis, His mercy, works in stages. He always works in stages. He doesn't do things right away on the spot. It took decades for the Holocaust before it finally happened, and every other disaster since then. He gives us time to work these things out. And if they still didn't get the message, then it went to their skin. So who did we call to deal with it? A doctor? No. And there were doctors. Listen, the Torah itself in Parashat Mishpatim talks about doctors. So doctors have existed. The concept of medicine has existed for a long time. A doctor has a mitzvah, his reshus, and a mitzvah to heal people. So doctors, but you didn't go to a doctor. You went to a Kohen. The Kohen was who came, took a look at it, examined it. If it was tsaras, there was a spiritual remedy because it was understood that this physical illness was a function of a spiritual sickness. So how's a doctor going to help you with that? You need a prophet for that. A prophet who talks to God and can say, oh, you know what the problem with you is? You did X, Y, and Z. God told me that. And therefore, you want to get rid of this, you have to get rid of that. The doctors, they existed. So what did doctors do? They were more like dietitians, because there's a Torah mitzvah, right? Of v'nishmartem mi'od es nafshosechem, right? The nafshosechem, that you have to take care of your body, to take care of your health. So doctors were there to advise you how to physically take care of your health, but the prophets were there to tell you to spiritually take care of your health. And that was more important than the other, because that's what determined whether the person got sick or not. And that continued as long as it was prophecy, but we lost prophecy because we stopped listening to the prophets. We just didn't want to we had to get with the program. So we abuse it, lose it. We lost the prophecy. So once we lost the prophecy, so then no one could tell us anymore what the spiritual problem was to figure out the physical problem. I mean, today, sometimes you bite your tongue. You don't bite it for the longest time. Also, you bite it the same day. You just spoke Lashon Hara, and you knew you spoke Lashon Hara. But sometimes you bite your tongue 2 weeks later, and you forget about the Lashon Hara you spoke back then, or whatever you might have done to be the source. It's a physical problem, and we deal with it in a physical way. So all of a sudden, when prophets disappear from the scene, we became stranded spiritually, and as a result of that, we became more physically involved in the world. God says, Parashat he says that if you're going to turn your back, and you're not going to do what you're supposed to do, you're not going to live according to Torah the way you're supposed to, then I'll hide my face. What does hiding my face translate into? That God's no longer going to run the world? Chas v'chalila. He always runs the world, never stops for a second. That he's not going to pay attention to the Jewish people like you. No, of course he's going to pay attention to Jewish people. But there's this fantastic relationship that we merit as being the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, where we're privy to what God's thinking and what he wants to do, because we're his partner in the fulfillment of the mandate of creation and the perfection of creation. So he tells us, he gave us a Torah to help us, an instruction book, to be able to implement policies that will allow us to be, the partners in Ma'aseh Bereshis that we were created to become. But Hester Panim means that God, he kind of like shuts his door. He's still the CEO, but where once the door was open and you could see him sitting at his desk, Kiviochel, and walk back and forth very freely. Every time you had a question, you just walked in and you got your answer. Now he says, that's enough. And he closes the door. And sometimes you knock and he still can't get in, so to speak. He's still doing his job, still running the show, and he still knows what's going on both sides of the door. We're the ones who lack that clarity. So all of a sudden there was a disconnection between what's happening in our lives, physically, what's happening in the world spiritually, in our lives spiritually. As a result of that, we dropped down in levels of hashgacha, where once we lived on a completely miraculous level. I mean, you read these stories and they sound like exaggerations. You go back to biblical times, to the times of the prophets, and you read the stories, it sounds like fantasy, like make-believe, like fairy tales. Alicia shows up at someone's house and she takes care of him, and she's a good, get host. And he wants to thank her. So he makes oil appear out of nowhere and keep filling the jars until she goes from being poor to being rich. And then he goes one step further. He gives her the capacity to have a child. And that child, unfortunately, dies very soon after, and he comes back and does the chis amazing. And miracles are taking place all the time. And we're like, wow, it's amazing. Great story, great story, great story, great story, great story. Were they real? Yeah. That was the reality. That was the level of hashgacha, of divine providence at that time. That's how God worked with us. We didn't appreciate it for whatever reason. It was a different generation with different tests, different strengths, different weaknesses. There's also, the deeper, hashgacha pratis, right? The deeper, level of divine providence that we're not necessarily privy to, that history has to go through, whatever growing pains it goes through in the end. But the end result was we lost the prophecy, we lost the connection, and now we went down to a lower level of divine providence that was more like that of the Gentile world. which meant that we had to start going to doctors more to deal with physical illnesses, because that's what God wanted. That was the mitzvah. We jumped from a high level where it was a spiritual thing and therefore dealt with in the spiritual realm, to having to now deal with spiritual problems in a physical realm, which just slows things down and messes them up a lot. So one might think, therefore, that as far as we're concerned, when prophecy ended, so did that level of divine providence, and for thousands of years we've been relegated to the realm of the Gentile world, and we have to follow their rules and live by what happens for them as well. Except that the Talmud was written in 499 CE, well after prophecy was closed. Even the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, was destroyed, and this is the second temple, which did not have the miracles of the first temple. It was destroyed in 70 CE, and almost 450 years later, that's when the temple is recorded, and they're recording stories like the one about Rabbi Yochanan. There's a discussion between Zunan and Rabbi Akiva. Zunan's a Jew, and he's talking to Rabbi Akiva, and he says to Rabbi Akiva, he says, what's going on over here, right? A person goes to a faith healer, a Gentile faith healer, someone who apparently has a reputation for being successful healing people. He goes in there, he can't walk, he has some kind of illness. The faith healer does some abracadabra, hocus, whatever he does, basically. The guy walks out. He's healed. And you and I both know, Rabbi Akiva, they have no power to do that. So what's God doing? What's happening there? So Rabbi Akiva gives him an analogy. He says, let me give you an analogy. What's the analogy? The analogy, let's say there's a guy in town, small town, no bank, and he's like the local banker. He's so trustworthy that people deposit their money with him. And he's so reliable, they don't even write out a document, any kind of star, to say that they left the money. Because every time they go for the money, they get exactly back what they brought in. But there's this one guy who's just, the type, he doesn't trust anybody, okay? And he demands each time that he drops off money, that witnesses stand there and watch him, give over his rubles, whatever he's giving over. One time he comes to this man in a rush, no time for witnesses. So what does he do? He gives the money, but witness free, okay? And he takes the money. Now, the man's wife, the bank guy, the guy who takes the money in, his wife is offended by this guy because she knows her husband's so trustworthy. Everyone trusts him, and this man refuses to trust her husband. So she has a plan. She says, you know what? Let's do the following thing. Let's when he comes back for his money, we'll say we don't have it. And when he says, I left it with you, everyone knows that this guy comes with witnesses all the time. So we'll just say to him, bring your witnesses. Of course, he has none. And everyone will believe you because they know that he always comes with witnesses. So this man turns to his wife and says, because of one paranoid, insecure guy, I'm going to put my whole reputation on the line and lie? No way. No way. He's got issues. But why should I break the rules and cheat just to teach him a lesson? I'm not going to do it. So Rabbi Akiva says, now what is this like? He says, every illness, by definition, is sent by God. There's nothing random. The Gemara discusses the concept about, let's say, what's called sitting in pachim, colds, fevers, to what extent does divine providence play a role in even the most everyday mundane illnesses? So there's different commentators talking about it, how. But certainly when it comes to major things like plagues and all that, that's considered for sure the hand of God, absolutely. And that's why there's a whole tractate called Titus, which is all about fast days, that was the response in Talmudic times and even today to some degree, to these, to fast and famines and diseases. that would spread. And they even give you technical definitions. What's called a plague. At what point do you have to fast and blow the shofar and go to the street and put on sack and ashes and all that. So it talks about that. So the Hashem sends the illness, but not just that. Hashem makes the illness take an oath. Okay, whatever that's supposed to mean. And the oath is that it's already been decided before the illness comes in how long the illness is going to last, which medicine is going to work to heal it, and which doctor, which person, or which shliach will be the one to bring it about. So what happens? Some guy gets sick, and the time is coming up. He needs to be healed. From what his thing, the illness is under contract to God, that it will only last until July 16th. And for some reason, on July 16th, this guy decides to go to a faith healer. And he's going to a faith healer exactly the time that this illness is supposed to end. It's not the shliach who's supposed to do it, right? And it's not the medicine that was prescribed. But this is what this guy is doing. So the illness says, something, this guy does not deserve to be healed. I really should stay longer. Even though I'm supposed to go, I should stay longer and keep this guy sick to teach him a lesson. He shouldn't go to the wrong kinds of people to be healed. But what can I do? I'm under oath with God. So I'm going to sacrifice my reputation because one guy is insecure and does the wrong thing by going to the wrong place. No. So he gets healed. The illness goes away exactly the same time that the faith healer is doing his stuff. And it looks like the faith healer was successful because of the timing, because of the coincidence of the entire thing. But it shows you, this is talking in Talmudic times. 500 CE, we're well into the Roman exile. It's our part of history. The prophetic time of Purim, right, and the first base of Mikdash is not our history. It's our history in origin, but not our quality of history, if you will. Because it was a different reality. The Jewish people were different. They were on a higher spiritual plane. And even though we read the stories and project our reality onto their reality, try to make it look like it's just the same thing, just going back in time. It's not. Their mentality was different. They related to the same concepts on a higher level. So therefore, everything worked on a higher level. So the Mordechai could know things through Ruach HaKodesh and prophecy and wrought miraculous redemptions against such a mighty enemy like Haman and Achashverosh and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To the point that we make a joke out of it. I mean, it's actually funny. This almost Holocaust is read like it's a joke because why? Because it's just so comical how Hashem played with the enemy in the entire, and we just focus on that. So that was then. That's not our history. Our history is more like post Second Temple, which was built by Herod, right? Hordes, and not the same Hashgacha. We didn't have the Arna Kodesh. We didn't have the Parochas. There was no Mizbeach, right? No sacrifices being brought. There was no smoke rising up without going. Flies were in the place, even though we didn't have the miracles talked about in Pirkei Avos, and yet they're still doing faith like Kabbalah, on a higher level. Hashgacha pratis. Chanina ben Dosa, we spoke about these stories in the Hanukkah time, right? Where his wife is poor, she puts rags into the oven to make it look like she's making challah. Her friend who wants to show her up, not really a friend, her neighbor wants to show up, comes in to open the ovens to show it's just rags burning. And lo and behold, their challah is burning, our challah is cooking instead, right? And the whole thing with the shemen zayis and the vinegar, etc., etc., etc. All these miracles taking place. The Gemara says anybody has a dream, they see the name Yochanan or Chanina or Hananya in a dream, they're guaranteed big miracles. Not just miracles, but big miracles. Double miracles in the end. So what is it? Which is it? Are we? How do we deal with this thing? How are we supposed to respond to reality? Are we on this level? On this level, do we have the hashgacha pratis of early generations, or are we we're subjugated by the lower level of hashgacha pratis? We live in Esau's world. We have to live like Esau. We have to follow his rules and do the same thing around the doctors. I mean, Rav Zilberstein, one of the Gedolim today in Eretz Yisrael, He's been very strong about this entire time. He put out a letter saying, based upon the Aruch HaShulchan, who was Rabbi Epstein from the 1800s, Torah Tamima and Chumash, and wrote a comprehensive work on the Shulchan Aruch called Aruch HaShulchan, which covers the entire Shulchan Aruch. And he quotes him and says that during times like now, when we don't have prophets, we don't even have a Sanhedrin or a Beis Din that can make decisions like this for the generation. So we're forced to listen to the doctors as if that's what the Beis Din says. So if the doctors are saying, go get a vaccine, go get a vaccine. You have to do it. That seems to say that that's what we have to do. That's what, And again, if you read my Parsha this week, I talk about the difference between doing it only for a health reason versus doing it as a function of Emunas Chachamim, listening to our Torah leaders. It's a whole different mitzvah. It made the same material, the same medicine, the same doctors doing it, the same procedure, everything is the same, except your kavana, your intention. But it can change the whole shmirah that you get from it, because you're doing it as a mitzvah of Emunas Chachamim, because they have Ruach HaKodesh. That's a shir unto itself. But again, Hanukkah just came along and said, you people are capable and ought to be living on a higher level of divine providence. You light your menorah to make this point. Are we talking out of two sides of our mouths? Which one is it? And if I decide to go with the one that says that my life is supposed to be more miraculous and on a higher level of divine providence, and I go ahead and I don't do something they're telling me to do, or I do something that they tell me I shouldn't do, because I figure I'm above nature, and it turns out that I'm not, then chai b'nafsho. It's as if if a person died, it's like they commit suicide. If they make themselves sick, then they're responsible for making themselves sick. On the other hand, if I am on a higher level and I'm supposed to be living in more miraculous reality, and I don't do that, it's a chilul, it's a profanation. It's a chilul Hashem, actually, because it's basically saying that I don't believe in God and divine providence, or at least I don't believe in the level of God or reality, that level. Then I'm just like everybody else, except that I happen to live by this thing called Torah and mitzvahs. It's a very difficult thing. So you can see the confusion that can result, and as a result of that, a lot of people are stranded. They're just like, wondering which direction to go. On one hand, we've become so pragmatic, we don't need bitachon and emunah anymore. How will I pay for this? I'll use my credit card. But I'm already maxed out. I'll use my father's credit card or my wife's credit card, or I'll get another credit card, open up another account, or I'll go to the bank, I'll get a loan. What about bitachon and emunah? That's a last resort. If the bank says no, my father says no, my wife can't, there's nothing else to do, then what else might as well trust in God. Well, that used to be the first choice. But we're not getting much help, because when you go to Gedolim, you ask for advice a lot of times. Most of the advice you get today is very physical and practical. Surprisingly, a lot of people go expecting to hear some type of real spiritual holy answer, and instead the answer comes back, talk to your doctor. Go to your bank manager, right? Ask, go around from door to door collecting, money to raise, to pay for this thing. We're at the end of history. That's for sure. We know that. That's what we've been talking about for some time now, and the sources seem to support that. History seems to support that. And the overriding question that we have to deal with right now, which Hanukkah really opens up, as the Pre-Talmud points out, Hanukkah is not just an 8-day holiday that comes along and then disappears, as it does for most people. Hanukkah, the word Chanukah, chinuch, means to dedicate something. It celebrates the rededication of the temple and the Mizbech. And the Zohar and the Medrash and everything else, basically on that level, points out and says that it's not just the rededication that we're remembering, but literally Hanukkah rededicates the entire year. Pesach is different because of what happened at Hanukkah. Shavuos is different because of what happened at Hanukkah. Hanukkah is like the opening to the next year, not New Year's Eve, not even Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is more like preparation. it's a preparation that begins on Rosh Hashanah that ends on Hanukkah. Hanukkah is considered to be the end of that process that began on Rosh Hashanah, went through Yom Kippur, went through Sukkot, got to Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is like that, now we're ready to start the next year on a higher level. But Hanukkah is a holiday about miracles. Nace, Gadol, Hayasham, or Po, depends where you're talking. That's Hanukkah is like, no, there's a high. Hanukkah takes place at a time when you think it's just total Hester Panim. God is long gone from talking to Jewish people through prophets. Way in the history, it's a black, dark, physical. The Greeks have been conquering all of well, not all of Europe, but they're working their way across Asia and Persia and all that, and they're like the next superpower at that time. And there's a pantheon, and there's Aristotle and Socrates, and that's where's the Jewish people, they're downtrodden. Shimon Tzaddik, the Kohen Gadol in his time, puts on the big day kahuna in an unprecedented manner, traipses across Eretz Israel to go meet Alexander someplace in the north, rather than wait for him to come down to him in the Beis Hamikdash, was what should happen. He shouldn't have to leave the Beis Hamikdash, but he did. How's that for a lower level of Hashgacha Pratis? And then comes Hanukkah, 180 years later, when it's way down the road and way worse. And it's this fantastic holiday that celebrates this miraculous level of divine providence that's reminiscent of the time of the prophets. To teach us what? To learn what? To tell us that that high level Hashgacha Pratis, it exists even today. You should know, even though it looks like I've dropped you off at the train station and gone on my way, you just go your way now. It's not true. The difference is, and this now ties back also to the Or HaGenuz, right? The hidden light of creation. The hidden light of creation. The first light that was ever made, the light that God hid on the first day, so the Rishoyim, the evil people of history, couldn't use it and abuse it. So God hid it. And all of us learned the Gemara and learned the Rashi who brings the Gemara down, that he hid it for when? From everybody. You, me, righteous people, bad people. It's hidden from everybody. But it will be reserved for the righteous people in the time to come. And that's what I learned year after year after year after year after year, until I saw the Leshem, a little bit of Kabbalah. And there he says, no, the hiding of the light meant not that it wasn't available anymore. It was still available. But the difference was, God said, from this point onward, it's not freely available. It can only be seen and used by people who are living on the level to do it, to use it, to see it. You have to go up to it. Remember we spoke about that, right? Climbing the ladder, the steps to the menorah, because you have to go up to have the light come down to you. That's the Or HaGenuz. And the Or HaGenuz is what all the miracles take place with, every single miracle, and the redemptions take place with it, and the Torah was given with this light, and the final redemption will occur with its light, and it's just whatever it touches, boom, big, huge miracles. And apparently it's available. Now, at all times. But I hate to say it, we're kind of like cowards. We don't want to make the changes. We don't want to go up. We don't want, it's like, come on, let's face it. Shabbos, all this food and, and a nice home and, air conditioning in the summertime and heaters in the wintertime. And, it's like the physical world, we've learned to adapt it to our needs. Rav Steinemann, Rav Aryeh Steinemann, who died, just a couple of years ago, he looked very, very much like he didn't eat enough, but he lived a long life into his hundreds, and he died still Paski Halacha. Mihalavai, the average person living to 90 to 95 should have his koiches. He was traveling and fundraising well into his 80s on airplanes and giving speeches, and he was not the only one, all of them, 90s, 100s and all that, and he subsisted on very little food, almost nothing. Every morning he began his day with a leban. It's like a white, kind of like liquidy yogurt that, quite frankly, is not so appetizing, but it's nutritious. got what you need from a milk product. And that's what he had every day. And one day his shamish, someone who took care, make sure he had the breakfast of his Lebanon in the morning, brought him a vanilla one, thought maybe he'd like it. He took one mouthful, one spoon, and said, "What is this?" It's vanilla. He says, "For years I've been having the plain one, and it's worked just fine. Why do I need to change it? Me, personally, wow, vanilla? Get rid of the other stuff. This tastes great. Nothing to do with nutrition, nothing to do with the mitzvahs I have to do. But I rationalize it because, it tastes so good, my bracha will be better, and I can praise God for the wonderful things. I got a great way to fit into my religious, requiem and justify the whole thing." But he was only interested in serving God. That's all he wanted to do. He was real about the world to come, and he lived a miraculous existence. Him and all the other Gedolei Ador lived very miraculous existence because they went up. They lived in that level. How do we end all this? What do we do with this information? Well, it's good to know, right? It's good to know that as low down on the spiritual totem pole as we may be at this stage of history, it's possible to go high up. It's possible to reach other levels of reality. Listen, Shabbos is a great example of this. On Shabbos, you may stay in the same house. The clothes exist in the same closet. You use the same oven to cook the food. It's like nothing has really changed physically that significantly. It's just that you dress nicer and you have a whole atmosphere. But spiritually, it's completely different. If you're keeping Shabbos properly with the right kavanah, the right intention, the right mindset, you actually ascend to a higher spiritual level of existence. And people talk about this. I mean, the Gemara says that Shabbos is 1/60th of the world to come, right? Right? So what does that mean? This, Shabbos is here and now. The world to come is at the end of 6,000. Shabbos lasts maybe 25 hours. Depends what you keep. Rabbeinu Tam, 26 hours, right? But it's a day. Olam haba, the world to come, is eternal. So how can you have that? Is it just a metaphor? It's just a way to encourage you to be more spiritual on Shabbos by telling you this? Or is there really some aspect of eternity inside this defined period of time? So in the physical world, you're right. It's clear. There are rules. There are boundaries. There are limitations. You can't expect two things to occupy the same space at one time. As they say, you can't dance at two chasnas at the same time. Unless, of course, both chasnas are taking place in the same hall. Then you can do it. But that doesn't count. Okay? It's a physical reality. You can't be in two places at one time. That's the physical world. Right? Two planes cannot land at the same time in the same runway. God forbid that'd be a crash. The spiritual world's different. Not bound by the same rules. So if a person is willing to climb that ladder, to make that change, to change that mentality, and believe me, it's an ongoing struggle. And you can tell when it happens. Someone mentioned to me today, based upon something else, that yes, it's clear that we have to change. One of the reasons why this virus came along was to make people change. Instead, people are adapting. They're working around it. You're looking for workarounds. Like no, let's change. God kicked us out of shul for a long time because there must be something wrong in the shuls. He kicked us out of simchas because there must be something wrong in the simchas. There's something He wants that we're supposed to have when we do all these things that we weren't doing. So what are those things? Let's do it. So for one thing, we should appreciate, that we can pray to Him as a minion, and so have kavanah, make it. Instead, people just they're not making the change. They're not going to a higher level. They're staying static. And there's a very big danger in that, by the way, because if God wants something, He doesn't give up. He just tightens the screws. All those nasty events in Jewish history didn't happen in the spur of the moment. They weren't God having a temper tantrum. They were what God had to, was forced to do, because Jews adapted and didn't change. Next week, we're going to start with Galas Mitzrayim. The Jewish people were enslaved for 116 years altogether. In the 116th year, the Jewish people cried to God, and God heard their tefillahs and then sent Moshe Rabbeinu to go save them. Question: what about the other 115 years? God couldn't hear properly. He just, finally got his hearing aid. Like, what happened? Why all of a sudden now he hears, but up until that point in time he didn't? So the answer is the Jewish people kept going, it could always be worse. It's bad, but it could always be worse. It could be doing this instead. And then it got worse. And this is worse, but it's not the worst it can be. It can always be worse. And God's going, what does it take to wake you people up, to make you realize that, you don't want it to get worse, and, make those changes now on this level? What does it take? For 115 years, we kept adapting and working around and adapting and working around, adapting, until finally God said, time has run out. We need to go. So, no holds barred. So what does he do? He puts a pharaoh into power and gives him a disease. And he gives him doctors and medical practitioners and necromancers and you name it, the whole thing. And they come up with a cure for him. And that cure is you have to bathe in the blood of Jewish children. Well, children, but might as well use the Jewish children because they're expendable. So next thing Paro is collecting Jewish children, cutting them open, taking their blood, putting it in a bathtub, and bathing it. You can't adapt to that. You can't adapt. That's outside the realm of adaptability. No, wait. So now they cry out to God, please stop this insanity. Oh, good. Just in time. And so God says Moshe, and Moshe does this thing, and we have the Exodus by Parshas Bo. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that is Jewish history, not just at the beginning, all through. I was always bothered by the question, why is it that we're always, at the end of an exile, going through the exact same thing? Don't we ever learn from the previous experiences? And the answer is no, because we're always adapting, always adapting. It's good to be able to adapt. There's times when you have no choice, because you have to make the best of the situation, but you also have to know when not to adapt anymore. When to say enough is enough, make the change and say to God, we're through already. But you just adapt. God says, well, that didn't work. No, I knew it wouldn't, but anyhow. But the truth is, it's not entirely true. Because in Mitzrayim, it didn't, like Moshe Rabbeinu goes down to Egypt the first time, and he talks to the Jewish people and says, God sent me, we're going out. So a small group of people, they form like a little group around Moshe Rabbeinu. We believe you. You said the password, we believe you. And whatever you say, we'll do. But the rest of the people, nothing. So Moshe performs a few miracles, turns the staff into a snake and the whole thing like that. And a few more people go, oh, well, that's interesting. That's pretty interesting. Okay, we're now with you as well. Unfortunately, we didn't join earlier, but we're prepared to go now. Another small group joins Moshe. But the other group goes, forget it. There were Egyptian kids doing the exact same thing, turning sticks into snakes and snakes into, So, and you grew up in Pharaoh's palace, so what's that supposed to prove? How do we know you're coming on the behalf of God? Forget it. So Moshe says, okay. And he performs 8 plagues. And in the course of the 8 plagues, other people are going, oh, now this is impressive. Past the 3rd plague, when the Khartoumim, right, the Egyptian magicians and all the people doing all the other stuff, like the blood and all that, we can't do this anymore. This is beyond our capability. And the fact that he can turn it on and turn it off at will, it's also beyond our capability. This must be the finger of God. So now when the Jews hear, oh, okay, so another group joins. And then by the 9th plague, God says, if anyone didn't get it by now, forget it. The 10th plague is me, myself, doing it personally. The plague of the firstborn. And there's no free will left at that point in time. So therefore, no one gets another choice after this plague. So in the 9th plague, God gets rid of all those disbelievers. And the most frightening, incredible thing, mind-blowing, mind-boggling, is when you do the cheshbon of how many people believed Moshe Rabbeinu, the great Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the greatest prophet to have ever lived, who came on behalf of the Almighty to do his thing. At the end of the day, only 1/5 of the Jewish population believed him and went out with him. 1/5, 4/5 of the Jewish population died in the plague of donkeys because they wouldn't make the leap. They wouldn't take the step. And even the 1/5 was on shaky ground too. But someone had to go out. And the Gemara says, "V'chein yimas Mashiach." The same thing will happen in the Messianic era. It's chilling thought, chilling idea. So here we are, crossroads, difficult period of time, history coming to an end, confusion, illness to deal with. Everybody has to ask themselves, where am I holding and where can I go next? Not physically, spiritually. Where can I rise? What I believe, how much trust in God do I really have and how much could I have and work at that? Because as you adjust yourself, God also adjusts your hashgacha pratis, not just in terms of what kind of miracles will happen to you and for you, but also what kind of knowledge you'll have to make your decisions as well. Because even though we're living a time of Hester Panim and tremendous darkness and blackness, God's still there, as always. And for the person is prepared to make take that step in the right direction, just like the Ohar Ganus by Hanukkah time, they become a fitting kli for the light of God, and it changes everything. So Hanukkah is over, but not really. It continues on in the hearts of the Jewish people for those who know how to do it. That's the challenge. That's our test, and I think it's enough to work with for the time being. So I wish you a pleasant evening, a good rest of your week, and perfect health.